Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Today I want to pick up my series on just archiving and cataloging my various RPG collections. I started this series back at the end of 2018. I wanted to be done by the end of 2018, but I also kind of experienced a lot of burnout and stuff around that time and just needed to take a break from making videos. And I've got to the point where I want to put out just fewer things. Try to have, at least 1 or 2 videos come out a week, but I don't want to push myself to the point where I don't enjoy doing this anymore. So, I took a bit of an extended break as far as that stuff goes, and I want to get back into finishing this particular series. So this is going to be my collection video for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition. So I've gone over my other non-D&D RPGs that I had at the time, as well as 1st edition AD&D, 0 edition, and the D&D Rule Cyclopedia, or D&D Basic. But today I want to actually go to where I began my Dungeons & Dragons journey. So I have a gamer origin story video on my channel. You can look for that if you want to know sort of that story. And long story short, I kind of had some negative experiences with Dungeon Masters using the 2nd edition AD&D rule set that made me kind of bitter and hostile towards 2nd edition. Not to the point where I hated it, but I just wasn't interested in it. And I kind of regret that now, and I did make a video sort of apologizing to 2nd edition AD&D, because this is actually a really great system. And when I went and started doing the Goblin Test videos, I really enjoyed picking up my 2nd edition books and looking through them again. So it kind of re-sparked a love of 2nd edition for me, and it led to me expanding at least a little bit my collection of 2nd edition products. Now, there are some things that I have for 2nd edition AD&D that are not going to appear in this video because they are campaign setting specific stuff that I want to do in separate videos, like Dragonlance and Ravenloft. And not that I have a lot of Ravenloft or Planescape stuff, but I want to do sort of a separate campaign setting video because I've already done Forgotten Realms and Eberron, so I want to sort of just have those sort of separated out. I do have a couple of campaign setting things that are going to be in this video, so just to have some of that stuff included. Excuse me. I'm still dealing with the after effects of a cold here, but why don't we just jump right into it with the very first Dungeons & Dragons book I ever owned, or at least a copy of it. So the first book I ever had was a copy of the 2nd edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide. Now the one that I had was pretty beat up. The corners of the covers were all rough and flayed out. The spine here was had this covering up top was sort of ripped off, and you could see the mesh binding that was underneath. But it was the very first book that I ever had for D&D, period. A few years later, a friend of mine, when he was closing out his store, just had some of his old stock that he was trying to sell off so that it wouldn't take up storage space. And so I ended up getting this from him, and this is a much nicer copy of the book. So the 2nd edition Dungeon Master's Guide was one of the very first book. It was the very first D&D book I ever had. So getting this book, and actually it was given to me by an acquaintance. So without that book, the collection that I have today may not exist in the form that it does. So I owe a lot to this covered version of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Now, the very first D&D book I ever purchased was this particular copy of the 2nd edition black covered Player's Handbook. So the Player's Handbook that comes in this style has, I think it's a knight on, it's mounted, I don't know if it's just on a horse or a Pegasus or something, it's kind of running through fire kind of thing that looks like. In fact, there might not be a picture of it here. Yeah, there it is. Oh no, it's not a Pegasus, it's just a horse, but maybe not fire either, but it's just his cape that's out. So I don't have this version of the Player's Handbook yet. That's sort of the last holy grail item that I'm trying to find for my collection. I've seen a few come in my area, but they've always been in pretty rough shape, and I'm not interested in buying something that's really horribly damaged, so I'll hold out for a nice condition copy, which will happen one of these days, I'm sure. But this was the very first book that I ever bought, and it got some mixed responses amongst my family. But I didn't go down the rabbit hole of being a devil worshiper was sort of the craze in the 1980s. And the only thing I could say is it's a good thing that I didn't start listening to Cradle of Filth at the same time I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, or I probably would have been locked away by family. But anyway, first book I ever owned, and still a very prized part of my collection. It's seen some pretty rough times. I've had to patch it up with some tape here and there, way back in like 2001, 2002. But still really awesome, and one of my favorite things to have just because it was the first book I ever bought. Shifting gears a little bit, so we have a player's handbook and a dungeon master's guide. The very original version of the monster book for 2nd edition AD&D didn't actually come in the form of a book. It came in the form of a series of compendium binders, and this was the first one. This is the only compendium binder that I have, but the idea was that you could take out the pages that you wanted for the monsters that you wanted, although it was actually bound so that the pages weren't individually already separated, and this is a little dusty, unfortunately. I didn't have a good place to store this. But you could sort of like take the pages out kind of idea and then use them that way. I'm not going to do that. But it is an interesting idea that lasted for a little while. There were a few of the different binders that were released. I don't know how many. I want to say there was at least a second one, and I want to say there was maybe a third, possibly a fourth. Early campaign setting products actually had sheets that would go in the binders, so they were like hole punched and everything. So it did carry on for a little while, but they did eventually get rid of this design. And they did start making just an actual hardcover book. So I have here the black covered variant of it, or the black covered version of the Dungeons and Dragons AD&D 2nd edition Monstrous Manual. Not the Monster Manual, the Monstrous Manual. Monstrous. Hand was a little bit too low for that. So the very first version of this book that came out was a white covered book. Had the exact same artwork that just took up, like, the dragon's wings, I think, went up further, and it had the blue AD&D logo on it. So it had this logo, sort of this kind of style, and the spine of the book was black, but the book itself was done in the style of these versions of the AD&D books before they made the one that I have there. So this is just basically a collection of sort of, I guess, the greatest hits from the first couple of compendiums, and there might even be a couple of campaign setting specific ones, like, for example, this Hooked Horror and this Imp. They're done in the same art style that a lot of the Planescape stuff was done in. So I don't know if these were in the original versions or not, but really awesome book as well. And I didn't actually have this book until I'd already been running D&D for, almost a year and a half. So I was making my own, like, NPCs or, like, borrowing a Monstrous Manual. So just kind of interesting there. Up next, just a couple of assorted supplement books that I picked up, again, when my friend was closing out his store. So the first one we got here is the Complete Wizard's Handbook. And I also have the Complete Book of Dwarves. I don't really want to go down and try to collect all of these because there are a ton of these kinds of books. The one that I really want to get is the complete book of, I think it's like Humanoids, Demi-Humans, because that's one that I actually remember using a lot when I was first getting into D&D. So it gave you the stats you needed to play like Minotaurs, which I did a couple of times, and I had friends that would play like Giantkin, like Vodkins, and stuff like that. So I would love to get that one, and probably the Book of Elves as well, because elves are my favorite race. But I don't really want to go and collect the whole series of this. Like I said, I got these mainly because, they were at a good price because a friend of mine was closing out his business. So, but they are still really cool books nonetheless. All right, up next, let's move on to a couple box sets. These are not in the greatest shape. I didn't pay a ton for them, so I'm okay with that. But the first one here is the Council of Worms. So this was a box set for having you play as dragons. Like, the whole idea was that the player characters were dragons, and they would have like their own sort of adventures and storylines that are grander in scale, I guess, than the standard player characters. So really, really awesome. One of the things that I wanted to get really badly, actually, when I first started getting into D&D, they had the updated version, which just had like the black cover style of like the player's handbook that I showed you. But by the time I had the money saved up to do it, I can't remember if they had, I think they had sold it, and then shortly after that, the store went out of business anyway. That was back in the old Towers Mall. For any of you watching that might live in the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia and remember the Towers Mall before it became Walmart. But that's where I ended up wanting to get this from. But a friend of mine, the friend who owned the store, this came in one day and I basically jumped on it. Alright, up next we have, and I've shown these before, but this one's in this is in really rough shape, but this is the Red Steel campaign setting box. So like the Savage Coast. I believe this was designed specifically for Mystara, but you could use some of the concepts inside of it with any campaign setting that you wanted to. So just some pretty cool stuff here. Includes some books, poster maps, and an audio soundtrack CD, which is right here. Haven't listened to it yet, but one of these days I will get around to that. And as I just commented on another video just recently, one of these days is like the catchphrase of the collector. It's like one of these days I'll get to reading all these books, or one of these days I'll listen to that CD. Just kind of interesting how that works out. The next set is the Red Steel Savage Baronies box set. So this is an expansion or a supplement to the Red Steel campaign. And again, I got these both at really good prices. This one also has the audio soundtrack CD, which I still haven't listened to, but one of these days. So we got those. So we're getting sort of down to the bottom, near the end of my collection here. So, like I said, second edition I'd never had a lot of stuff for, unfortunately. But I will go through my most recent additions to my second edition AD&D collection, and my most recent additions goes all the way back to 2013, when Wizards of the Coast was doing like reprints for AD&D First Edition, 3.5, 0 Edition, and they also did Second Edition. I wanted to run a Second Edition game. We had sort of gone through and run, I was running 3.5 for my friends, then we took a break from that, and a friend of mine ran Pathfinder, and then another friend ran First Edition AD&D. And it's like, well, if we've done first, we've done third, I ran a 4th edition game. It's like, why don't we just go through and do all of the editions that were available at the time, and I was going to run second. So I wanted to have a second copy of the Player's Handbook, and this was around the time that these reprints came out. So I've got the reprint version of the Player's Handbook. So this is the same Player's Handbook as the version that I showed you before, but it's got like the fancy sort of green, shiny metallic cover, which is kind of cool. Unfortunately, a little bit of paint chipped off, or ink, I guess, whatever you want to call it, chipped off, so you can kind of see like that one shiny little spot. That's how the book arrived, so it's not something that happened after I picked it up, but still pretty cool nonetheless to have that. This would be my DM's copy if I were to run it, so that's the copy that no one ever lays hands on except for me. And I also never had a copy of the black covered version of the Dungeon Master's Guide, so when these reprints came out, I jumped on the opportunity to get the Dungeon Master's Guide. So this is the black covered version. This is like the revised AD&D Second Edition DMG that came out. The original came out in like 1995, I believe it was. So this is a version of that. I did not get the Monstrous Manual, even though I was tempted to, because I already had a regular copy of it, of the black spine version. And I also had the Monsters Compendium binder, so I really didn't need a third version of like the Monsters Manual. But I still picked up these here, and like I said, so I have the black spine version of the DMG now. All that's left for me to get is the original cover version of the AD&D Second Edition Player's Handbook, and I will be set. So a couple years ago now, this was sort of when I was doing like my Goblin Test videos, and this is when I was really starting to change my opinion of Second Edition AD&D. So I was at a local game store here in the city called the Monster Comic Lounge, and they have a pretty good selection of used RPG stuff. So I went and was able to pick up a subset of Second Edition AD&D that is pretty polarizing. There are people that love it. There are people that hate it. There are people in between as well. I'm not very personally familiar with the first two of these, but the last one is one that I actually do remember using in second edition AD&D games back when I first started getting into the hobby. But the first one we have here is the player. So this is the player's options set. So this is the player's option spells and magic. So I'm not entirely. I actually haven't really read through this yet to know exactly what's in here, but I think there's like information on familiars, some variant types of spellcasting classes, some variant types of like magic, ways for you to cast your magic. No table of contents at the beginning, which is interesting. But anyway, I just thought this was, a really cool pickup. This was the most expensive of the three as well, so I guess it's the one that may be the most sought after. I don't know. I only paid, I think, it was less than $20, I think, for it though, so I'm okay with that. Yeah, so that's the player's option spells and magic. Up next, we have the player's option combat and tactics. This goes over things like critical hits and fumbles and some other things along those lines. I think there might be stuff on mass combat as well. I'm not 100% sure on that. This one actually does have a table of contents, even though the other one didn't seem to, which is weird, but oh no, it does. It's just, okay, never mind. The other book does have a table of contents. The pages didn't come apart for me when I first, anyway. Blunder aside, so this just goes through things like weapon mastery, unarmed combat, some new armor types, based off different ages throughout history, critical hits, siege warfare, just a lot of interesting stuff along those lines that haven't read it yet, but one of these days I will get to doing that. So we got that, and then we have the one I'm actually personally familiar with, and that is the Skills and Powers book. So a friend of mine had this and made some characters out of it, really kind of cheesing like the wrestling and like unarmed strike charts that were in here, but or maybe that weren't in here, but that he was able to use with weapons mastery and stuff like that. Anyway, one of the cool things that this book had was it broke down each of the ability scores. So in AD&D, like your strength, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, charisma, all those skills or all those attributes had like a chart that you would look up to see what your ability score basically gave you. So I was just looking at the description of how this stuff worked. I'm not going to get into that right now, because I would have to read it up on it. But basically, what this did is it would break your ability score down into two subcategories. And you would, essentially what you do is you divide, you would multiply your prime ability score, I think, by 2. And then you could divide the points however you wanted. But there were rules for how much you could distribute into one or the other. I'm not going to get into that right now, but basically, so strength was broken down into stamina and then muscle. So stamina, the only thing stamina actually oversaw was how much you could carry, although you might make stamina checks for things such as like if you're traveling like forced marches or stuff like that. You might make an ability check against your stamina instead of just against your strength or constitution. And then you had your muscle, which gave you things like your damage adjustments, your maximum press, open bars and open doors and bend bars and lift gates. And so like dexterity would break down to like aim and balance. Constitution would be like health for things like system shock, poison save, and then fitness for hit point adjustment and resurrection survival. And it just broke down the ability scores like that, so you could kind of get the best benefits that you wanted. If you had, so even though you had like a 16 strength, you might be able to have it so that your muscle was 17, but your endurance was like 15, I think, were the options they gave here. So you could have like the higher strength thing for hits, like to hit and damage, but have a lesser strength for like being able to sustain like carrying weight. So I thought that was kind of neat. And then the last one that we have here is the second edition AD&D Book of Artifacts. I got this from DM's Guild, which is an affiliate of Drive-Thru RPG. This is part of the print-on-demand service, and just an excellent service. It's allowed me to get several, really highly sought-after products for my collection, and this was one of the most recent ones. And actually, this is the most recent one, actually, at the time that I'm recording this, that I've ordered, had printed off, and actually received in the mail. So there we go. So that is my second edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons collection. So let me know in the comments below, have any of you watching played second edition AD&D? Sorry, like I'm still dealing with a bit of a cold here. So have you played second edition AD&D? What are your thoughts on the version, on the edition? Do you still play it? Have you maybe never stopped playing it? There's some people that, picked up second and never looked back. So let me know what your thoughts on second edition AD&D are in the comments. I would love to know. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Take care.